Uncontrollable sexual desire, that impulse that burns silently in the depths of the soul, is not an aberration, a moral weakness, or a modern vice, but an archetypal expression of human nature. Carl Gustav Jung, with his lens turned to the invisible mysteries of the psyche, would never see this desire as something to be simply fought or extirpated, but as a legitimate and powerful manifestation of the vital energy that dwells within all of us. Jung did not treat sex only as a physiological act, but as a symbol loaded with psychic and spiritual meanings. In his view, desire is not born only from the body. It emanates from the soul, from the unconscious, from the oldest and most forgotten places that reside in every human being. For Jung, everything that is repressed becomes a shadow. And desire, when denied, hidden, moralized, or imprisoned under the rules of a tyrannical superego, does not disappear, it transforms. If during the day the individual strives to appear controlled, chaste, or virtuous, at night the shadow finds its ways. In disturbing dreams, unexpected impulses, toxic relationships, secret addictions, or recurring fantasies. Sexual energy does not accept to be ignored. She is not silent in the face of repression. On the contrary, it is strengthened in the darkness, waiting for the moment to emerge, not to destroy, but to be heard, understood, integrated. Jung saw sexual desire as a portal to the most intimate self-knowledge. He understood that libido, a term that for him went beyond the sexual, encompassing all forms of psychic energy, seeks expression, meaning, and direction. When channeled only for immediate pleasure, it empties. When channeled with awareness, it becomes creation, transformation, enlightenment. Desire, when accepted with lucidity, ceases to be a tyrant that governs thoughts and becomes a guide that points to what is missing in the soul. It reveals where life is repressed, where vitality has been blocked, where the being has lost touch with its totality. An uncontrollable desire is not a mistake. It is a sign. It is the voice of the unconscious screaming for balance. It's not just about wanting sex, it is about wanting something more. Union, belonging, intensity, transcendence. The desire that consumes is often the desire for fusion, the eagerness to find in the other what has been lost in him. Jung would say that sexual longing, especially when exacerbated, is the reflection of a deeper search, the search for the self, for completeness, for reconnection with what has been fragmented. In this context, sex ceases to be just body upon body and becomes a symbol of duality trying to unite, of masculine and feminine trying to reconcile within themselves. Culture teaches the subject to fear desire. Society teaches him to hide it. Religion often demonizes him. But Jung invites him to do the opposite, enter the dark cave where desire dwells, not to blindly give in to it, but to listen to it, to understand where it comes from, what it reveals, what it hides. He would not preach indulgence, but conscience. He would not speak of sin, but of fragmentation. Because desire, as chaotic as it may seem, is a message, and those who ignore it run the risk of being possessed by it. In many cases, uncontrollable sexual desire is a cry from the shadow for recognition. The individual who does not recognize his emotional needs, his hunger for affection, his fragility in the face of loneliness, may end up displacing all this to sexuality. Desire becomes escape. It becomes an addiction. But behind the repeated, empty act is a soul crying out for true connection. Jung would not judge this behavior, he would listen. He would see there a symbol of a soul that has lost itself. And it would help the subject to find the true origin of this longing. Perhaps a trauma, a loss, a childhood wound, an absence of love that was never healed. Throughout life, everyone carries masks, roles they play to be accepted. But desire does not respect masks. He emerges when you least expect it, breaking carefully assembled characters. It is in these moments of weakness that the true self appears. Therefore, Jung would not ask the individual to fight against desire as if he were an enemy. He would suggest that you look at it with courage, that he recognized him, that he understood his symbolic language. Because desire always points to something that is missing. And what is missing needs to be integrated, not denied. Sexual repression does not only imprison the body, it mutilates the soul. When desire is considered dirty, dangerous, shameful, the subject starts to live torn between what he feels and what he thinks he should feel. This split is the root of many psychic sufferings. Jung called this dissociation. The cure, for him, is not in choosing a side, but in integrating opposites. In recognizing that the human being is light and shadow, reason and instinct, spirit and flesh, and that only integration leads to individuation, the process of becoming who you really are. Therefore, instead of fighting against uncontrollable sexual desire, Jung would invite the subject to talk to him, writing about him, dreaming about him, creating with it, to make him art, expression, symbol. Because desire does not want to dominate, it wants to be seen. And when it is seen with awareness, it transforms. It is transmuted into creative energy, into the power of transformation, into a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious self. Ultimately, desire is a master. A wild, untamed, but wise master. He teaches about limits, about hunger, about absence, about connection, about pleasure and pain. To deny it is to deny a piece of the soul. But blindly accepting it is also dangerous. The real journey is in the middle, welcoming desire, listening to what it reveals without getting lost in it. Jung believed that the path of the soul is a path of balance, and desire, like everything human, needs integration, not exile. Therefore, when the desire seems too strong, almost unbearable, do not see it as your enemy. See it as a mirror. Ask yourself, what is he trying to show me? What is missing in my life? What am I not seeing in myself? Uncontrollable sexual desire is not a problem. It is an invitation. A call from the psyche for you to look deeper, more honestly, more lovingly at yourself. And perhaps, as you respond to that call with awareness, you'll discover that what seemed out of control was actually a desperate attempt to be whole again. If desire is a master, then every impulse that burns silently in the body is a hidden lesson, a truth that has not yet been translated by consciousness. Jung understood that sexuality was not just the impulse of two bodies in search of pleasure, but the most visceral expression of the soul's yearning for unity, for a return to the origin, for the transcendence of separation. At bottom, desire is not just physical, it is a metaphysical echo, a reverberation of the primordial division between self and other, between being and world. And in its most intense form, uncontrollable sexual desire is the soul trying to remember something that the ego has forgotten, that the human being is, first and foremost, a being in search of reconnection. Jung saw in Eros, this force of connection, attraction, union, a fundamental principle of life. It is not just eroticism in the modern sense of the word, but a cosmic principle that seeks to integrate what is separate. When sexual desire reaches levels of uncontrollable intensity, it can be interpreted as a collapse of this principle, a desperate attempt by the psyche to restore a broken inner connection, to heal a division that has formed within the soul. And the more the person tries to control the desire with moralism, judgments, or denial, the more it intensifies. Not because he is indomitable, but because he is trying to draw attention to a deeper wound. Often, this desire is aroused not by external stimuli, but by internal needs. The absence of meaning, the existential emptiness, the disconnection with spirituality, all this can be disguised as an exacerbated libido. Desire, then, becomes a disguise of loneliness. And Jung knew that the unconscious loves masks. He creates fantasies, compulsions, repetitive patterns, not to deceive, but to protect. Uncontrollable desire can then be the symbolic reflection of a soul protecting itself from emptiness. Because the body still feels, even when the soul hides. And desire is one of the last places where life still pulsates. But Jung would not invite anyone to blindly surrender to this impulse. What he proposed was more difficult, to cross it. To dive into it with awareness, as if entering a dark forest in search of its own center. Because every desire carries within it a symbol, and every symbol a message. When one is dominated by repetitive, obsessive impulses, it is not a character defect, but an unconscious process that has not yet been understood. And, according to Jung, everything that is not brought to consciousness returns as destiny. The sexual desire that dominates the mind can be the reflection of something much deeper that needs to emerge, and that, when not heard, takes over one's entire life. There are those who spend years trying to control themselves, fighting thoughts, avoiding stimuli, building walls around their own body. But walls do not heal. Only the encounter heals. Jung believed that the unconscious is like an underground river, and that if the current is blocked, the water will seek another outlet. So it is with desire. If the libido is ignored, it will seek distorted paths, superficial relationships, compulsive pornography, dangerous idealizations, self-deprecation. Desire does not want punishment. He wants to listen. He wants symbolization. He wants integration. Within every human being, according to Jung, there are archetypal forces in constant dialogue and conflict. Sexual desire can often be the archetype of the lover manifesting. The lover is not only the one who wants pleasure, he is the one who seeks life, who longs for beauty, for fusion, for ecstasy. But when this archetype is out of balance, it takes over everything. The person starts to live according to desire, to measure their own self-esteem by their ability to seduce or be desired, to reduce their human bonds to carnal experiences. What the lover needs, however, is not censorship, it is recognition. The way is not to repress it, but to make it dialogue with other archetypes, the sage, the warrior, the healer. Because only in this way does the energy of desire find purpose. Jung also talked about the animus and the anima, the inner masculine and feminine principles present in all individuals. Intense sexual desire can be the reflection of a wounded anima for men or a distorted animus for women. The man who compulsively seeks the female body may, in fact, be projecting his anima not yet integrated. He seeks outside what he should develop within himself: sensitivity, receptivity, intuition. The woman who feels desires that frighten her may be confronted with an aggressive, overly rational animus that needs to be understood and balanced. Desire, therefore, is also a mirror of the inner polarities in imbalance. There is a tragic beauty to this journey, because those who suffer from uncontrollable desires are, in fact, being called in. It's the unconscious screaming, "Look at me! I exist! I'm alive!" It is an invitation to the most difficult dive of all, the one that is not made towards the other, but towards the abyss itself. Because only when desire is welcomed, felt, named, interpreted, does it cease to be a prison and become a path. And this path does not lead to control, but to communion. Communion with the body, with the soul, with the mystery that dwells in the heart of the human being. Jung knew that desire, as carnal as it may seem, is a spiritual symbol. It is a spark of primordial creative energy, the same energy that creates universes, that moves stars, that gives shape to matter. Sexuality, when lived with presence, becomes ritual. When expressed with respect, it becomes healing. When it is truly welcomed, it becomes a portal. The problem was never desire, it was the way human beings learned to deal with it. It was the fear, the shame, the rigidity. And, paradoxically, it was also the excess of permissiveness, the trivialization, the emotional disconnection. Jung did not choose extremes. He proposed the means, the path of consciousness. Therefore, when someone says that they suffer from an uncontrollable sexual desire, they are not just saying that they feel desire. You're saying you're sorry, and you don't know how to deal with it. He is saying that his soul pulsates, that his flesh screams, that his mind is confused. And Jung, with his deep listening and his symbolic vision, would welcome this confession with compassion. He would not offer a ready-made solution, but a map. A map for the unconscious, where each symbol of desire can be translated, resignified, transmuted. This map is not linear. It requires patience, courage, presence. It requires the person to reconcile with their history, with their pains, with their needs. That he looks at his parents, his first experiences, his traumas. Because sexual desire also carries the memories of the past. It is an echo of childhood, adolescence, unhealed frustrations. To integrate desire is also to heal the wounded child, the confused adolescent, the lonely adult. And this is not done overnight. But it is done. And when it is done, it liberates. Ultimately, desire is the language of the soul when it is hungry. He says, I want to live more intensely. I want to feel it more deeply. I want to join something bigger. And this union is not only with the other, it is with the whole. Sexual desire, when understood in depth, does not lead to empty pleasure, but to the sacred. It becomes incarnate spirituality. It becomes prayer with the body, meditation in movement, transcendence in the flesh. He reveals that, deep down, there is no separation between the divine and the human. There are only layers that need to be integrated. So when the desire seems too strong, don't run away from it. Sit with him. Listen to him. Ask him what he wants to show you. Because Jung knew, what we are most afraid to look at is exactly what needs to be seen most. And perhaps, when you look at this desire in the face, you will discover that it does not want to destroy you. It wants to wake you up. He wants to take you back home. To the center of oneself, where love is not obsession, where pleasure is not escape, where desire is just another way of remembering that being alive is also a sacred mystery. When the soul is seized by an uncontrollable sexual desire, it is not only struggling against the physical impulse. It is dialoguing with deep archetypal forces that, for centuries, have been repressed, distorted, or devalued. Carl Jung understood that desire is a legitimate expression of psychic energy, a manifestation of the libido in its most intense and, at the same time, most symbolic form. It is not, therefore, an error of nature, but a forgotten language, a cry of the unconscious for integration. In many ancient traditions, desire was not treated as sin, but as a portal. Through it, the human being accessed not only pleasure, but also the truth about himself. In modern times, however, society has oscillated between stifling puritanism and empty permissiveness. At both extremes, desire has been emptied of its sacred dimension. It was reduced to behavior or pathology. Jung, on the other hand, saw in him a bridge, a passage between the conscious and the unconscious, between the persona and the shadow, between the ego and the self. What does it mean, then, to live with a desire that seems greater than control? For Jung, it means that the vital energy is looking for a way out. But this exit is not always literal, nor should it be understood superficially. Intense sexual desire can be the symbol of a soul that has moved too far away from its center, that lives under patterns that do not correspond to its essence. It can be the symbolic manifestation of a blocked creativity, of a repressed love, of a neglected spiritual path. In other words, desire speaks, and what it says goes beyond the body. There are times when sexuality becomes a compulsion, and this is not a sign of moral promiscuity, but of a fragmented soul. The constant drive isn't just biological, it's a desperate search for belonging, for fusion, for meaning. Desire becomes a compulsion when the inner connection is broken. And, according to Jung, everything that is compulsive needs to be looked at with love and analysis. Compulsion is the soul's way of asking for help. It is the way the unconscious signals that something essential has been forgotten. Behind many uncontrolled impulses, an old affective need is hidden. The child who was not touched, the teenager who was not seen, the adult who did not learn to love himself. Sexual desire, then, becomes an unconscious way of trying to fill this hole. But because emptiness is emotional and spiritual, no physical experience can completely quench it. And it is precisely this repeated frustration that generates the cycle of compulsion. The more one seeks outside, the less one finds inside. And the abyss deepens. Jung would not judge this process. On the contrary, he would welcome it with the wisdom of one who understands that everything that emerges from the soul has a reason. He would invite the person to investigate his dreams, his inner images, his fantasies. Because, for Jung, sexual fantasies are not just daydreams of desire, they are symbolic maps of the psyche. The content that emerges in the imagination reveals what is hidden in the unconscious. And by interpreting these symbols, the individual begins to know himself in depth. Many repetitive fantasies carry the symbolic charge of traumas, family patterns, religious repressions. They are ways for the soul to try to integrate that which has been excluded. Often there is a hidden pain behind an uncontrollable desire, a pain that could not be expressed in words, but which now manifests itself as an impulse. Jung believed that all unfelt pain becomes a symptom, and exaggerated sexual desire can often be a symptom of unworked pain, of unnamed neediness, of the wound that has not been looked at. The journey of integration, in this sense, is not a path of denial of desire, but of deepening it. Not in the literal sense of living it at any cost, but of understanding its origin, its symbolism, its function. Jung taught that the symbol heals, and desire, when understood as a symbol, reveals much more than instinct. He shows what the soul lacks. It shows the distortions of the self-image, the conflicts with the feminine or with the masculine internally, the idealizations projected on the other. It is common that, in states of exacerbated desire, the person projects too much. Projection, in analytical psychology, is a mechanism by which internal contents are placed on top of the other. In this way, the desired partner becomes more than a body. He becomes the bearer of divine qualities, of promises of salvation, of existential fulfillment. This projection, however, is unsustainable, and when it breaks, the desire collapses or turns into frustration. Jung warned about this risk. The more we idealize the other, the less we see ourselves. Therefore, uncontrollable sexual desire is often the desire to merge with one's own soul. The search for the other, in these cases, is the search for the self, the organizing center of the psyche, which unites opposites, which reconciles light and shadow. The problem is not in the desire itself, but in the illusion that it will be solved on the outside. When this illusion is sustained for a long time, desire becomes an addiction. And addiction is the substitute for transcendence. It is the failed attempt to reconnect with the divine through paths that do not lead to integration. But desire can also be transmuted. When it is welcomed with presence, with listening, with self-love, it becomes a creative force, a refined intuition, an impulse for life. The energy that moves desire is the same that moves art, spirituality, compassion. Jung called this sublimation, not in the sense of repression, but transfiguration. It is when sexual energy is not denied, but channeled into other forms of expression. One learns to dance with one's own fire, without getting burned. The key is in consciousness. What makes a craving uncontrollable is not its intensity, but the lack of awareness about it. When the impulse is lived blindly, it dominates. When it is looked at in depth, it teaches. Desire becomes a kind of guide, sometimes confusing, sometimes painful, but always revealing. And with each revelation, the soul becomes more whole. The journey is not easy. It requires confrontation, vulnerability, radical honesty. But it is this confrontation that heals. Jung said that one does not enlighten oneself by imagining figures of light, but by making darkness conscious. Uncontrollable desire, then, is one of these darknesses. He shows the places not yet loved, the rejected pieces, the hidden truths. He points to the shadow, not as an enemy, but as a necessary part of being. And by integrating the shadow, desire is balanced. It ceases to be urgency and becomes a presence. It stops being anxiety and becomes intimacy. It stops being a compulsion and becomes a meeting. At the end of this journey, the desire does not disappear. He transforms. He remains human, intense, real. But it no longer enslaves. It does not dominate. It does not kidnap at will. He becomes part of a vaster being, more conscious, more connected with his wholeness. Desire, then, becomes love, not romantic, idealized love, but love as an archetypal force that unites the fragments of being. And in this state, even the silence of the body can be erotic, because eroticism, for Jung, was not restricted to touch, but to presence. Thus, the question changes from how to control the desire to what does he want to show me? And this question opens paths inward, paths of reconciliation, healing paths, because in the end, desire is the invitation of the soul for you to find yourself again. In the silence that remains after so much restlessness, when desire no longer screams as it once did, but whispers with the softness of a breeze that knows the soul, something profound is revealed. It is no longer the body that commands, nor the ego that demands. Now it is the psyche that contemplates. It is the being who recognizes himself in his own abysses and understands at last that the intensity of desire was not a mistake, it was a call. An urgent request from you to you. A symbolic attempt by the unconscious to rebalance the sacred that has been lost. Carl Jung, with his archetypal and compassionate lens, would not condemn the individual for living an uncontrolled desire. He would invite him to dialogue with this. Because, for Jung, everything that is strong in the soul has something to say. And desire, when listened to with humility, becomes revelation. It becomes a mirror of what is out of balance, but also of what still pulsates with life and truth. The uncompensated libido is often a soul that has been silenced. A sensibility that has not found channels of expression. A heart that loved little, or that was little loved. Then desire arises as an impulse, as urgency, as a fever. But, deep down, it is a search for connection. Search for meaning. Search for belonging. It is the soul's impulse to feel whole again. And there is no cure in judgment. There is no reconciliation in repression. Integration only occurs when there is acceptance. When the human being allows himself to look at himself with eyes of compassion, recognizing that even his most disconcerting impulses are attempts at healing. Jung taught that what we do not face in ourselves will eventually dominate us. But what we welcome, even what scares us, is transformed. Uncontrollable sexual desire is one of those forces that asks for recognition. Not to be denied, but to be understood. Because it brings, hidden in its potency, the key to a radical transformation, the possibility of reconnecting with the soul. Sexuality, when seen in the light of consciousness, becomes a portal. It is no longer just instinct and becomes a bridge. A bridge between the internal world and the external world. A bridge between the human and the divine. At this point in the journey, it is no longer a matter of controlling desire, but of knowing it. It is no longer a matter of denying the body, but of listening to what it tries to say. And, more profoundly, it is no longer a matter of satisfying at any cost, but of understanding that true pleasure is born when we are whole. Desire calms down when the being finds a broader meaning for its own existence. When the soul is touched, the body rests. And what was once compulsion becomes wisdom. What was once urgency becomes intimacy. What was once confusion becomes clarity. And the human being, who once felt dominated by his passions, now walks with them without being dragged. He integrates them. He honors them. And with that, he finds something that Jung deeply valued, the balance between opposites. The reconciliation between instinct and spirit. The union between shadow and light. This process is not immediate. It requires time, patience, depth. It requires painful dives into the unconscious, revisits to the past, conversations with one's own fear. But it is in this process that the being finds itself. And when he finds himself, he discovers that desire was not the enemy. He was a guide. An intense guide, yes. Sometimes wild, but never irrelevant. He led even the most forgotten parts of the being. And it was there, in this place of reunion, that the healing began. Carl Jung would say that there is wisdom in everything that challenges us to grow. And desire is one of those masters. It requires courage, but it offers truth. It deconstructs masks, but it builds consciousness. It disturbs, but reveals. And when it is finally welcomed, when it is listened to with the whole soul, it becomes